What's up, guys? Neil Orfield here, and I'm going to show you how I will be setting up my fantasy cruncher for tonight's single game slate between the Raiders and the Rams. I'll be setting up for the largest field GPP on FanDuel. While you're coming in, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that alert button so you can get alerts when our shows go live. All right, first thing I'm going to do is adjust my columns. I've got a quick view saved so I can see what I want to see in the middle of my screen. Those being ownership projections, my projections, exposure cap, and how much I get of players after I've run a crunch. Next, I'm going to sort by projection and just get rid of every player with the projection of 0, with the exception of Baker Mayfield, who is likely going to be playing tonight. Or sorry, who might be playing tonight. We don't know what the situation is yet with Baker Mayfield. So he's the one player that I'm going to keep checked. And all these other players that I'm removing here, I'm doing it because once I'm making groups later, they don't show up on that screen. And as you can see, there's a lot of these players who just project for 0 fantasy points. And it's a little bit harder to find the players that you do want to find when all of these players are showing up on that screen. So this just saves a little bit of time to remove these players. Doesn't really affect too much because you're not getting these players in your lineups anyway if they project for 0 fantasy points. All right, next I'm going to go to the MVP tab here, set an exposure cap. For this slate, I think 20%, once again, is a pretty good cap. That means I can't get more than 20% of any one player in the MVP spot. On FanDuel, honestly, there's an argument to be made that because some players project so much better than others, looks like here's Jacobs, Carr, Adams, and Wolford, and then a huge gap. Maybe you could set this to 25%, 30%, and just get more of these guys that project so much better. But, I think there's at least a possibility that guys like Matt Collins, Cam Akers, these guys have a big game. So maybe it makes sense to split up, one of those 20% segments among those guys and hopefully get 20% each of these guys. Yeah, I don't know. It's iffy, but I'm going to leave it at 20% for now. All right, going into advanced options. I'm going to be working here in the general tab and the groups tab. Starting in the general tab, unique players per lineup. I'm going to set up for a 150 set here. So in a 150 set, I'm going to leave this at 1 unique player per lineup, which means that my lineups can be 1 player apart from each other. If you are making 40 or fewer lineups, I would probably set this at 2 unique players per lineup for the sake of diversifying your lineup set. Team salary, I'm not going to set a minimum. I will set a maximum. Again, this is for the purpose of avoiding the most duplicated lineups. This is an even bigger issue on FanDuel than it is on DraftKings because there is no salary multiplier in the MVP spot. And because there's just 5 players per lineup versus 6, you can run into some serious dupe trains on FanDuel. So I really go out of my way to avoid being duplicated on FanDuel. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to set a max salary. So you're not using the full 60,000 allowed by FanDuel. I'm going to set it at 58,500. And again, when I say I'm avoiding dupes, I don't mean that I'm trying to be completely unique. I mean, obviously that would be great if I am. That is the preference, but I'm just trying to avoid, majorly duplicated lineups. Offensive players versus defense. Default is set to a max of 2 players. I'm going to change this to a max of 4 players so I can have 4 players from one team against the defense of the opposing team. We've seen this work before this year in the Bengals-Browns game, at least that one. I don't know if there have been others as well. I think this is a very good spot where we could see 4 Raiders against the Rams defense, because I think there's a chance here that the Rams offense just cannot get anything going. Maybe not. Maybe they'll be good because they are playing against a very bad Raiders defense. But I think there's at least some chance that the Rams offense can't get much done, and the Rams defense will be the one player or, thing that you want in your fantasy lineup here. All right, so I'm going to leave that at 4 offensive players versus defense. Global exposure cap, I'm going to leave this at 100%. I already set the 20% cap in the MVP spot specifically. And then randomness, I'm going to set this at 30%. If you want more control over your lineups, use a lower randomness. I think 30% is a good starting place for me to incorporate some randomness into the process while also allowing me a good amount of control over my player exposures and stuff like that. So I'm going to leave this at 30%. And then minimum projection included in calculation. Default is 3. I'm going to leave it at 3. And if there's a player who I want in my player pool who projects for fewer than 3 fantasy points, I'm just going to manually boost their projections a little bit to make sure it's above 3. And then players from each team max, the default is set to 4. I'm going to leave that at 4 so I can have 4 players from one team against 1 player from the opposing team. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool. 0 risk because it's all free. So sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. Now, group tab. Here's where I'm going to set some correlations, and typically the most important, the ones that I consider kind of mandatory, are the quarterback correlations. So I'm going to start with a Derek Carr MVP group. So this group is going to be just for lineups that have Derek Carr in the MVP spot. So I'm going to find Derek Carr in the MVP, make him my key player. So that's what these lineups revolve around, is the key players. Now I'm going to sort by position, and I'm going to add to a secondary group all of the Raiders pass catchers. Devontae Adams, Keelan Cole, Matt Collins, DJ Turner, Jacob Hollister, Foster Moreau. And then I'm going to include Josh Jacobs and Amir Abdullah. I don't know if you need to include Brandon Bolden, Jacob Johnson. I guess if you're playing them, maybe it's fine to include them in these groups. Okay, now for this group, I'm going to require just 1 player from the secondary group. I'm going to say, if Derek Carr is in the MVP spot, use at least 1 player from this group. And on top of that, because I think typically, if you've got a quarterback in the MVP spot who does not have a ton of rushing upside, which Derek Carr does not have a ton of rushing upside, typically I'm going to want multiple pass catchers from the Raiders when I have Derek Carr in the MVP spot. So I'm also going to go ahead and give boost to these pass catchers. You can see that Devontae Adams is just a little bit cheaper than Josh Jacobs, but projects significantly worse. So I think this is a spot where I am going to give a boost to Devontae Adams to make it more likely that I get 2 Devontae Adams in these lineups rather than Josh Jacobs. I'm not going to give any kind of boost to Josh Jacobs again, just because he already projects so well. I think he's already going to make it into a good number of these lineups. And then I guess I'll give boost to these other running backs. I don't know that I really need to. I don't know that they're going to make it into too many lineups anyway, though. All right, next group, I'm going to make a Rams quarterback MVP group. Reason I'm not naming a Rams quarterback is the Rams have not named a Rams quarterback. If John Wolford is healthy enough to play, it sounds like he's going to be the quarterback. Otherwise, Baker Mayfield is going to play. So it's good that we at least have that clarity, that it's going to be one of the 2 of these guys at least. But I'm going to add John Wolford as a key player. I'm also going to add, sorry, I did not choose the MVP option there. All right, let me redo that. I'm going to add John Wolford in the MVP spot as my key player. I'm also going to add Baker Mayfield in the MVP spot as a key player. And then whenever, we get news tonight, whichever of these guys is not starting will have a projection of 0. So, it's not going to matter that I have both of them in this group. They're just going to have a projection of 0. You're not going to get them in lineups anyway. The group is still going to apply to whichever one does have a projection. So I've got the quarterback in the MVP, as a key player in the MVP spot. Now I'm going to add these flex receivers to a secondary group. And for the Rams, I don't think you need to include the running backs. The Rams running back who leads the group in receiving, Cam Akers, has 8 targets on the year. So none of these guys very involved in the passing game. I'm just going to exclude them. And then again, I'm going to do the same thing I did with Derek Carr. I'm going to say require only 1, but I'm going to give boost to these pass catchers so that I'm more likely to get to multiple. And I'm giving bigger boosts to these guys than I usually do, just because none of them project all that well point per dollar. Let's start with 14. I'm going to do 14% for these guys. All right, I think that's a good group for these quarterbacks. I'm going to make another group that is Carr in the flex. So I'll find Derek Carr at quarterback, make him my key player. And then once again, add all these Raiders pass catchers to a secondary group. And now, because I have Carr in the flex, I can also include these Raiders pass catchers in the MVP spot. There are a lot of them. Okay, good. That'll do it for that group. And for this group, all I'm going to do is I'm going to require at least one. I'm not going to give boosts or anything. All I'm saying is if you've got Derek Carr in a lineup in the flex, I want at least one Raiders pass catcher somewhere in the lineup with him. And then finally, same thing for the Rams quarterback. This is a spot where I think it does matter to me a little bit which quarterback we're talking about, because I think that if it's Baker Mayfield, I would do the same thing I did with the Carr group where I'm just requiring one. If it is John Wolford, I might consider, let me look at the price tags. We got Wolford at 13, so he's actually more expensive than Baker Mayfield. He has shown a little bit of rushing upside in his very limited career. He had a game where he rushed 6 times for 56 yards. He seems to be at least okay at rushing the ball. And given that he's, a decent rusher and the Rams offense might not be able to do much, I think that there is a greater possibility for Wolford to be optimal in the flex without bringing along any pass catchers. Obviously if he rushes for a touchdown, that makes it a lot more likely. But even if he doesn't, I think, if he just rushes for, 40, 50 yards, spreads the ball around in the passing game, and nobody scores a touchdown, I could see John Wolford just being the highest scoring Ram and possibly make it into the optimal lineup. So I think it's debatable what you want to do here, but I'm going to set up as though it is Baker Mayfield. So I'm going to require at least one. I'm just going to do the usual. So I'm going to add all of these Rams pass catchers to a secondary group. I mean, this part of it, you set up the same either way. So I'll show you what I would do depending on who is at quarterback. So either way, I'm adding all these pass catchers, again, not including running backs because they're just not that involved in the passing game for the Rams. Also adding all of them in the MVP spot. We've got a lot of pass catching options for the Rams. I'm guessing that once inactives come out, we're going to lose a couple of these guys, but honestly, I'm not really sure. Okay, so for this group, if it is, I didn't even add the quarterbacks yet, so let me go do that. I'll add both in the flex. I'm going to add Baker Mayfield as a key player, Baker Mayfield quarterback as a key player, and then John Wolford quarterback as a key player as well. All right, so if we get news that it's Baker Mayfield starting, I'm going to leave it just like this. I'm going to say if I've got Baker Mayfield in the flex, require at least one. If we get news that it's John Wolford starting, I think I would actually go and check this box, say only apply plus minus adjustments, and then give boost to all of these players, something like 12%. I don't know, give them some kind of boost to make it more likely, because I don't want to have a bunch of lineups that have John Wolford in the flex without any pass catchers, but I want to allow for it if I'm making a 150 set and he's the starting quarterback. Again, just because I'm not sure the offense is going to score that many points, and I think John Wolford has enough rushing upside that he could be optimal in the flex without bringing along any pass catchers. So I want to allow for that possibility without getting to a ton of it. So I would probably go ahead and, if he's the starting quarterback for this group, only apply plus minus adjustments and then, give like a 12%, 10%. I'm not sure exactly how much of a boost I'd want to give, but just make it more likely that if you got John Wolford in there, you're getting another Rams pass catcher as well. For now, though, I'm just going to require at least one. And I don't think that would be the wrong approach either. I think it's pretty borderline whether I'd want to require one or just give boosts. Kind of a personal preference whether you want to include some of those lineups with Wolford and no pass catchers. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool. Zero risk because it's all free. So sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. All right, so next I'm going to crunch out 150 lineups using my projections. And look at the correlation. So now there are two things that I do after I've done my crunch. I look at the correlations of the lineups that have been created, and I look at player exposures to see if they're around where I want them to be. So starting here with correlations, very first lineup, we see Derek Carr with just Josh Jacobs. I think that's fine. I think that this is, Josh Jacobs is pretty involved in the passing game. This would probably be a situation where Josh Jacobs has a receiving touchdown. I think this lineup, with Derek Carr in the flex, you don't really need more than one pass catching option. And I think Josh Jacobs is a fine pass catching options to include with him. So that's fine. And then we also have John Wolford with Tutu Atwell and Kieran Williams. Didn't even include Kieran Williams in the set. So we just required Tutu Atwell, but looks good. I think this looks like a fine lineup. Second lineup, we see Wolford with two pass catching options. That looks good. I didn't require it. I only gave boost to players. I only required one pass catcher with Wolford in the MVP spot and then gave boost to make it more likely I get two. I do prefer the lineups that have two. I would just allow for one in a 150 set in some cases. And here again, we've got Carr and Jacobs. Now we've got Carr in the MVP spot with Jacobs. I don't love this one as much, so I prefer this one with Jacobs in the MVP and Carr in the flex. This one, it's a little bit thinner just because for Carr to be the optimal MVP, he's obviously scoring a lot of fantasy points, and Carr doesn't have a ton of rushing upside. So it makes it less likely for Carr to be the optimal MVP without multiple pass catchers. So I don't want to see a ton of it, but if I see it again, occasionally in a 150 set, certainly this, has a possibility of succeeding if Derek Carr throws for, if he throws a touchdown to Devontae Adams, for example, he gets those fantasy points, and Devontae Adams also very expensive. So Derek Carr throws a touchdown to Devontae Adams, also throws a touchdown to Josh Jacobs, and spreads the ball around, maybe adds a little bit on the ground. I think it's a lineup that could work out. It's a little bit thin, but I'm going to allow for it because, again, I think it is possible for this kind of lineup to work out. And we also have John Wolford here with Austin Trammell. That looks good. Here we don't have Derek Carr in the lineup at all. That's totally fine. Wolford with Atwell and Skowronek looks good. Here we've got Wolford with Skowronek, Carr with Jacobs again. So we are seeing a ton of lineups that have just Carr and Jacobs. That is not my favorite thing. I would prefer to see some more lineups with pass catchers with Derek Carr. I mean, obviously Josh Jacobs is a pass catcher, but other pass catchers along with Derek Carr. So we're seeing a ton of that. I don't totally love that. I'm seeing more than I'd like. But rather than actually going and adjusting the correlations, the first thing I'm going to do is just see, am I getting to these other pass catchers as much as I'd like to? So I'm going to go through position by position, see how much I'm getting of different players, whether I want more, whether I want less. Looks like I'm getting a lot of Derek Carr and John Wolford. Generally a good thing. I like having quarterbacks on a single game slate on FanDuel in particular. All right, in the running back spot, we can see we're getting to a ton of Josh Jacobs. He is the highest projected player on the slate. That's not a huge shock. I'm going to sort by salary here. And you can see Cam Akers, the second most expensive, not getting much of him at all. He's just too expensive for a guy who's in a committee. But maybe I want more than zero, so I'd go ahead and give him a little bit of a projection boost. Amir Abdullah not getting into none of these guys could currently make it into lineups because they all project for fewer than 3 fantasy points. Maybe I want Abdullah to be in my lineup set, give him a projection above 3. Maybe Zamir White as well. And then I go to wide receivers and I can see, okay, I'm only getting to 24% Devontae Adams. So that's why I was getting so many of those lineups with Derek Carr and Josh Jacobs instead of Devontae Adams. And that's because Josh Jacobs does project significantly better than Devontae, like 4 fantasy points better than Devontae Adams. It makes sense that I'm getting to a lot more of Josh Jacobs than Devontae Adams. But then I like to look at the Stokastic single game tool. So I look at it for FanDuel, and I can see we've got Josh Jacobs in the optimal in the flex 57% of the time, Devontae Adams 40% of the time. So there is a gap there still, but it's not as big as the projections would suggest. Generally, I prefer looking at these numbers, getting closer to, using these numbers to determine how much I want of each player rather than the actual projections. So in this, it's a little bit closer than the projections would suggest. So I'd rather get a little bit more Devontae Adams, maybe at the expense of some Josh Jacobs. So I'm going to give Adams a little bit of a boost. Van Jefferson not getting much at all. He obviously doesn't project that well point per dollar. Going to give him a little bit of a boost. Matt Collins, again, only getting into 12%, but I think that he is a decent play. Going to give him a little bit of a boost. Brandon Powell not getting much. And you can see I'm getting to a lot of these cheaper guys. And, it makes sense because I did set a salary cap. And on this slate in particular, there are just not that many players who project all that well. There's a big gap between the guys at the top and the rest of the field. So what it's naturally doing, Fantasy Cruncher, given the difference in projections, is it's trying to jam in those guys who project really well. And especially with the salary cap that I set there, it's requiring to have some very cheap players in there. So I'm getting to a ton of these guys, not getting to a ton of these more mid-range guys, and that kind of makes sense. That's going to happen naturally. But maybe I'll at least spread out among these guys. Hutchin, add him into the fold. And then hopefully as I give these mid-range guys boosts, I'll get a little bit more of those guys and maybe a little bit less of the studs. Foster Moreau doesn't project all that well, not getting to a ton. Maybe give him a boost. Tyler Higbee, same thing. Bryson Hopkins, maybe get him into the player pool. Try to get a little bit more Matt Gay. Raiders defense kind of interesting. Pretty expensive here, but they are going up against a Rams offense that just does not look that good with the backup quarterback in. So I don't know exactly how much I'm going to want, but maybe give them a little bit of a projection boost and then try and get a little bit of Rams in my set as well. I'll see what happens now. I'm just going to crunch it out. All right, so you can see here right away, Derek Carr now has multiple pass catches. I prefer that. I didn't do anything to change the correlations, but because I gave boost to the pass catchers, now I'm getting a little bit more Foster Moreau, and the lineups are looking a little bit better right away. Wolford still getting multiple pass catchers. Like to see that. Yeah, in general, now I'm getting multiple pass catches with Derek Carr. In general, I think these lineups look a little bit better than they were previously, and I didn't even change the correlations. I just changed the projections a little bit. Got Devontae Adams close enough that because I'm giving him the boost when he's in lineups with Derek Carr, I'm now getting him in more of those lineups than just Josh Jacobs with Derek Carr. So here's an example. Probably before I gave that projection boost, and if I didn't give any kind of so I gave a boost when I was making my correlations. I gave a boost to all the pass catchers when I have Derek Carr in the MVP spot. And as you saw, I gave a boost to Devontae Adams, but I did not give a boost to Josh Jacobs. So even though it's only requiring one, it makes it more likely that I get to Devontae Adams because of the boost. So in this lineup, I like this better. Derek Carr with just Devontae Adams in the flex. I like that better than just Josh Jacobs all the time. In general, I'd say these look a little bit better than the lineups were previously. And then the other thing I do, so I look at the lineups again, do they correlate well enough? And then again, exposures, I just go through again and say, okay, getting to 14% Rams, Raiders, 0% Rams. Maybe give the Raiders just a tiny little boost to keep up with the other changes I'm making, and then give the Rams a bigger boost if I want some of them. And then same thing at every position. You're making adjustments here and there to try and get to the exposures that you like. Sometimes I'll crunch it out 20, 30 times before I get to the actual exposure levels that I like. So I'm not going to do that here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this is just my general thought process. I go through position by position, looking at the players, how much I'm getting to them, and what do I need to do to get to how much I want of them? Do I want more? Do I want less? How much do I need to change their projections to get to an appropriate amount? And it's all relative. Projections are all relative to the other players on the slate, and then you also have to keep in mind the salaries involved in making these boosts and negative boosts. See here, I'm still not getting much Van Jefferson. Matt Collins still getting some of these cheaper guys a little bit. It's a little bit more spread out now, though, since I've added some of these other players. So I prefer it to be at least a little bit more spread out, but still, maybe I want more Devontae Adams. Still getting to a ton of Josh Jacobs. No Cam Akers. Maybe I give a boost there. But I'm not going to go through this whole process right now. I'm just, again, showing you the general process, which is looking at correlations, looking at exposures, making sure that they all look about how I want them to. It's a long process, though. It can take several crunches, so I'm not going to do it here. Hope you can find some success tonight doing something similar to this. Good luck.